Why does slowing down a single verse, rather than adding more information, sometimes produce a noticeable internal shift? This question seems paradoxical in a culture trained to associate depth with accumulation. Understanding is often assumed to increase with speed, efficiency, and quantity. More reading, more listening, more data. Yet everyday experience, supported by modern cognitive science, suggests something counterintuitive. Slower cognitive processing can deepen perception, stabilize emotional response, and improve memory consolidation. Meaning does not always arrive through acceleration. It often appears through receptivity. This is where Ibn Arabi offers an unexpectedly precise insight. His claim is not that recitation produces supernatural effects, nor that sound itself carries mystical power in isolation. He argues that meaning does not enter consciousness by force. It appears when the perceiving faculty becomes ready, when people report that something opens during slow recitation. This is often misunderstood as emotional excitement, religious suggestion, or metaphysical intrusion. What opens is far more subtle and far more rational. It is a shift in attention, a reorganization of perception, and an expanded capacity to register meaning that was already present. The task, then, is to explain what opens, why it opens, and how Ibn Arabi's framework aligns closely with modern cognitive science. To understand why this opening feels unusual, it helps to describe the modern cognitive condition in scientific terms. Most contemporary minds operate under chronic stress, fragmented attention, and continuous information exposure. Neuroscience describes this as a state of sustained cognitive load, where executive control systems remain constantly active. Attention becomes defensive rather than receptive, oriented toward rapid categorization and threat reduction. Psychology identifies several mechanisms at work here. One is attention bias, the tendency to process information quickly and selectively, filtering for relevance or risk. Another is cognitive fatigue, caused by prolonged engagement of top-down control networks. Over time, this leads to emotional dysregulation, a reduced ability to metabolize meaning without either intellectualizing it or reacting to it. In this state, reading and listening are optimized for extraction rather than integration. Speed becomes the priority. Meaning is treated as data to be collected, summarized, or judged, rather than as an experience to be inhabited. A contradiction emerges. Humans seek depth, coherence, and understanding, yet systematically train themselves to process reality in fragments and at speed. The mind remains active, but the receptive faculty, the capacity to allow meaning to reorganize perception, lies largely dormant. Ibn Arabi addressed this condition centuries ago, not through a critique of technology, but through a structured theory of consciousness and perception. He lived between 1165 and 1240 in Andalusia and the broader Islamic world. He was a jurist, theologian, philosopher, and systematic metaphysician. He is often labeled a mystic, but that term can be misleading if it implies emotionalism or opposition to reason. His writings reveal rigorous conceptual architecture, precise definitions, and an internally coherent epistemology. His central concern was not belief, but how knowledge becomes possible. One of his key premises is that reality is layered, and perception depends on the mode of consciousness through which reality is approached. Knowledge unfolds according to ontological readiness, not effort alone. This is a rational claim. The structure of the perceiver determines what can be perceived. In modern terms, This aligns with levels of processing theory in cognitive psychology, which shows that deeper semantic processing leads to more durable understanding. It also parallels predictive processing models in neuroscience, where perception shifts when top-down expectations quiet down. Ibn Arabi is therefore relevant not as a devotional guide, but as a theorist of attention, meaning, and consciousness, one whose insights anticipate contemporary scientific frameworks. One of his core principles is that meaning emerges when time is widened, not compressed. For him, recitation is not primarily about sound production or repetition. It is about temporal presence. Slowness allows meaning to arrive rather than be consumed. When cognition is rushed, the mind relies heavily on prediction, anticipating what comes next and minimizing surprise. From a cognitive perspective, fast processing prioritizes efficiency. Slow processing allows sensory input, emotional response, and semantic interpretation to integrate. This distinction resembles dual process theory. The difference between fast automatic cognition and slow reflective cognition, slow recitation, also activates physiological mechanisms associated with regulation rather than arousal. Research shows that slower rhythms stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, increasing emotional stability. This creates internal conditions conducive to integration rather than defense. Consider the difference between skimming a text and reading it aloud slowly. Studies consistently show that slower, vocalized reading improves comprehension, memory encoding, and emotional resonance. The content remains the same, but the depth of access changes. In this sense, what opens is access to semantic layers that speed habitually bypasses. Another principle concerns Ibn Arabi's use of the term heart. In his framework, the heart is not a metaphor for emotion, nor a symbol of sentimentality. It is a faculty of perception. The heart is described as mutable, reflective, and receptive. It perceives meaning before conceptual articulation. This does not contradict reason, it precedes it. Modern neuroscience offers useful parallels. Integration between prefrontal regions and limbic systems allows cognition to remain flexible rather than rigid. Interoceptive awareness enables the body to inform understanding without overwhelming it. When recitation slows, bodily awareness increases and cognitive defensiveness decreases. The mind stops grasping for meaning. Instead, meaning is allowed to organize itself within awareness. This resembles therapeutic techniques used in trauma recovery, where slow verbal repetition stabilizes physiological responses. In such contexts, insight emerges not through analysis alone, but through regulated presence. What opens, then, is not emotion. It is interpretive capacity, the ability to allow meaning to register without distortion. A third principle concerns speech itself. Ibn Arabi held that language is not merely symbolic. Letters and sounds carry ontological weight. This does not imply vague mystical vibrations, but rather that sound participates in reality through form and rhythm. A rational interpretation frames this in terms of auditory patterns, synchronize attention, and bodily rhythms. Neuroscience shows that repetition regulates neural oscillations, and slower rhythms promote coherence across brain networks. Chanting, or slow vocalization, engages auditory motor loops that stabilize focus and reduce cognitive noise. This is why chanting differs significantly from silent reading. Even when the words are identical, the opening occurs when internal rhythms synchronize with structured meaning. Attention becomes unified rather than scattered. allowing perception to deepen. A final principle addresses the role of the self. For Ibn Arabi, the primary obstacle to knowledge is not ignorance, but self-interference. Knowledge is already present within reality. What blocks access is egoic striving, the constant attempt to control, evaluate, or perform understanding. Psychology identifies a relevant mechanism here in self-referential processing and rumination. Slowness and rhythmic repetition reduce their dominance. Slow recitation interrupts the self-narrative and performance anxiety. The mind shifts from control to attunement. This explains why insight often arises during walking, showering, or quiet repetition. Moments when effort relaxes. What opens is not something new, but access to what was previously obscured. It is important to clarify what this process is not. It is not magical incantation, emotional intoxication, or belief-induced suggestion. It is an epistemological shift, a change in how knowledge becomes knowable. There is a paradox here. Effort is required to stop forcing. Discipline creates the conditions, but insight itself arrives unforced. Ibn Arabi was precise about this distinction. Modern research on creativity and insight confirms the same pattern. Understanding emerges most reliably in low-noise cognitive states, where attention is stable and self-interference is minimal. This framework can be applied without religious commitment. Choose a short text or phrase. Recite it slowly, aloud, with deliberate pauses. The goal is not interpretation, but stabilization of attention. The cognitive mechanisms involved include attentional anchoring, emotional regulation, and reduction of predictive bias. Consistency matters more than duration. This approach aligns with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and verbal anchoring techniques used in trauma recovery. No belief is required, only participation in the process. What opens is not mystical, but structural. Ibn Arabi offers a theory of meaning that aligns remarkably well with modern cognitive science. Slowness is not regression. It is access to depth. The verse does not change, the listener does. When the mind stops rushing meaning reveals itself.